On today's episode of Hollywood Rants, Tales from the Curmudgeon of North Hollywood, I want to talk about what's going on with A24. As you all might have heard, A24 is one of those small independent companies that has been given the Horatio Alger treatment, that everyone is saying that it's one of those miracles that keeps on giving. They've had hit after hit after hit, including the Academy Award winner for Best Picture Moonlight, including the highly successful Lady Bird, including all of the excitement around their upcoming new feature called Zola, which deals with the world of social media. So why would there be any trouble in paradise as far as A24 is concerned? Well, Variety over the past 2 days has published 2 exclusives about the company. And whenever I see 2 exclusives coming in a trade, it always makes me wonder if there is something rotten in the state of Denmark. And in the case of A24, there's a lot of stuff that makes my old school home video based mind say there's a problem going on with this company. So let's start with what is A24. A24 was started slightly after 2010 with a number of low-budget independent films that happened to get the attention of a lot of critics, as well as a lot of film students who felt that this was a company that was following along in the footsteps of those maverick production companies in the 80s and 90s, which did a lot of low-budget features. We might remember them as companies such as Orion, which admittedly had been around a long time before that, Carolco, Vestron, New Line, New World. There were just a whole host of them. And they were all looking after doing that niche of films that didn't cost a lot of money, had very high artistic output, and somehow made their balance sheets work. I mean, we think of things like DEG, which released Blue Velvet, or Island Alive, which did things like The Trip to Bountiful and Kiss of the Spider Woman. You know, little movies that somehow ended up making tremendous profits. And yet all of those companies are no longer with us. All of them collapsed. And I'm seeing the same signs that the same thing might be happening with A24. Let's start with the first article. The first article talks in very enthusiastic terms about how A24 has just turned down an offer to, or at least has floated an offer where they would be willing to sell the company for somewhere between 2.5 billion and 3 billion. And there's a lot of industryites who chirp in on that article and say, well, that actually seems fairly reasonable because they seem geared for explosive growth and they've created a lot of excitement within the industry. At the same time, you had other people go, well, what's their asset base? Yeah, they have a library of films, but those films aren't necessarily all that strong. And then the article had something in it that really put my antenna up. And that was they compared what A24 should be worth with how much money was spent by Amazon to buy MGM. And I'm going, hold on a second here, Charlie. When Amazon paid that amount of money for MGM, they were only paying $2 billion for a library that stretched all the way back to 1983. 1983, I believe. It might have been a little bit later, but it was right around there. And they also were buying James Bond's title. Now, remember when they wanted to sell the last James Bond movie altogether for about, or the Bond franchise all by itself for $6 billion. So that actually as a combined asset is pretty good, as well as the strategic benefits that a company like MGM had that Amazon Prime really doesn't. Now remember, part of the reason Amazon Prime is even there is to draw people into the Amazon universe. And unlike Netflix, unlike Apple Plus, unlike any of the other streaming services, Amazon's is not there to make money by itself. It's merely there to be an add-on for those members who are Prime. It is there to draw people in so that they can make additional purchases. So to have a responsible outside entity, assuming that MGM is responsible, and I'm going to say it is, because it's been able to survive even in its mini major state for quite a while. They have a certain amount of know-how. What's the proof that that A24 has that know-how? I'm going to say the other thing that really set me off was the article that landed today, which said that Zola is going to be available for streaming. Note I said available, not that there was a deal in place for it. That Zola was going to be available for streaming 3 weeks out from its theatrical release. And I'm going, That reminds me rather uncomfortably of a little movie that was out a couple of years ago called The Irishman, where Netflix spent $175 million on it, and then they sort of dug their heels in and said there wasn't going to be a longer-term theatrical release because they needed to capitalize on its streaming potential. And I thought at that moment, no. You're not going to spend that kind of money, which translates into, in order for that to be considered a box office success, especially one that has zero chance of selling t-shirts, hats, toys, and all of that, you're looking at a box office gross to justify that of about $1 billion internationally. And we all know that there's no way in hell that the Irishman could have ever made that money. So that was clearly an attempt to bury bad financial news with this kind of, oh, well, streaming is becoming so big and this is proof of its maturing and all of that. And ever since then, I've been sure that what was probably happening was Netflix was burning through its venture capital as fast as humanly possible, and that they were probably going to be in trouble at some point. By the way, I still feel that. And the fact that they're doing now content that is much lower in budget and much higher in scandal content leads me to suspect that they're having to cut their costs severely. So the jury's still out. Maybe Apple will step in as an angel or something like that and buy Netflix, and then we won't have to deal with this fakakta Apple TV, which is not doing well, and it's kind of an embarrassment, and all of that. So then, because then they'd have the installed base, and that would make sense. Where I'm thinking that this is really a problem is that I'm now going to say that I think that A24 has blown through its venture capital, and it's been trying to get additional venture capital, and that additional venture capital is not forthcoming. Now, why do I think that additional venture capital is not forthcoming? Because buried in the articles, remember, you can never read an article by just looking at the first paragraph. That's just a bunch of BS. You really need to read the whole thing. If you're not going to read the whole thing, don't jump to the end, because people say, oh, I'll just read the beginning and then I'll read the end because things are buried at the end. No, they're not. They're not buried at the end. They're buried in the middle, especially the middle, a little bit past the middle. That's where the devil in the details is. And in the middle of that part of the article, we see that they were looking to do an output deal with Apple, but that didn't happen. Warning sign. And how about Amazon Prime? No output deal with them. So therefore, they're kind of orphans out there. They're trying to sell things on an a la carte basis. And we might say, yeah, but they've had major successes. Now, this is where being an old guy really benefits, because I saw what happened in the past with exactly this scenario, where you have a movie like Moonlighting, which costs $4 million and makes just under $70 million. Now, that's a very nice return, especially for something that has such a limited appeal story. And then we look at Lady Bird, which cost about $10 million and returned, somewhere in the somewhere in the high 70s. But in terms of return per dollar invested, that's not as good an investment as Moonlight. So there's a little bit of trouble in paradise. And then we look at some of their other titles, like Under the Skin, which cost $13.5 million and made somewhere around $6 million. So now we're looking at a burned asset there, that we're looking at something that lost a lot of money. And we look at their first movie, which there's no quote on how much it cost, but that it ultimately made just slightly over 200,000. Now it's a first movie, so it's a first try. But I'm going to say that probably in 2016 and 2017, on the strength of Lady Bird, on their gross numbers, the fact that it escalated, not that the budget more than doubled, but that the return escalated, that they were probably able to get another chunk of VC, because venture capital, because the article had buried in it something else. And that says the company had over 100 employees, and they had office space in New York City and Los Angeles. Now, having worked for a company that had office space in New York City and Los Angeles, I'm telling you, these are not cheap real estate markets. Remember, New York City is over $100 for Class A office space. You're looking at over $100 a year per square foot. Look at Los Angeles. You're probably looking at roughly the same amount. And plus you're paying for parking in LA and all of that. And these are not 1,000 square foot places. You're looking at millions of dollars just going out there and rent. How much are the salaries? How much are the benefits? Because remember, these are full-time employees. These are not people who are hired on for a production. That's actually a very robust staff. That's when I was working in Fremantle, and there was Family Feud and Price is Right and Baywatch and Air America and a whole host of other shows. There weren't 100 employees in the LA office at that time. The New York office had a lot of people because they were handling a lot of the first run syndication, sales, and distribution. But that's an awful lot of personnel for not a lot of money coming in. So let's flash back to the past and look at why I'm saying this is bad news for them. In the late 80s and early 90s, you had this big expansion of independent producers making those movies, as I mentioned, and a lot of them were doing quite well. In fact, you had a company like Carolco, which was doing what Netflix is doing now, which is putting incredible amounts of money on the table and getting everyone in Hollywood, everyone meaning the agents, to give them their highest and best projects, because it was clear that they were going to pay above the industry going rate. This is also called hooking a fool. Why do I say that? There's a reason why there are certain numbers as industry going rates. And it's not that everyone in Hollywood's a cheapskate, although they are. What it is it's saying that you spend more than this amount of money and you will probably lose it. But in the case of Carolco, and I believe in the case of Netflix, there was a strategy behind that. That was to spend that money and get that knowledge that you are a big player. And because of that, you'll get big content. And while you're getting that big content, that will give you enough publicity headwind to where you can become a much stronger company. Well, in the midst of that time, the credit lines for your average production company, not Carolco, we're gonna put that aside, because Carolco is always a high flyer, probably laundering money. You didn't hear me say that. Well, remember that Ricardo Mestres, who ran, Ricardo Mestres was the head of Hollywood Pictures for a while. I'm talking about Menendez, the one who was murdered by his two sons. He was president of Live Home Video, which had a very, very close deal with Carolco. And when he was murdered, let's just say the Live Home Video went into a tailspin, and so did Carolco, because there was something about the way he was doing the money that was tricky, and no one else knew it because he kept it in his head. But lots of companies did things this way, so do not think that that was unusual or in any way criminal, although I'm rather leaning to think that there was other stuff going on. But definitely there was that messed up. So we're going to put that aside, because no one expects that the kids are going to murder daddy, who happens to know all of this complex financial stuff and it's not on paper because they don't want to get audited. So these other companies had about $100 million line of credit. Vestron and others, and Vestron had done Dirty Dancing and Platoon, so they were doing very well. And you had Orion doing the Woody Allen movies, and they were doing very well. And Charles Weintraub, who had produced The Karate Kid, came on board. And he all of a sudden got a $700 million line of credit. And these other companies are going, WTF? Why is Charles Weintraub getting so much more than us? True, Karate Kid had been an incredible moneymaker, but that still seemed really weird because these other companies had good return on investment. Nonetheless, the money on all of those companies, courtesy of Credit Lyonnais Bank and a gentleman by the name of Franz Hoffman, who you will notice if you study this part of the business, was on the board of every one of these companies, making a nice chunk of change on it. I'm not going to go there either. Anyway, so all of a sudden, you had these companies having $1 billion line of credit. I know today that's laughable, but trust me, in late 80s, early 90s terms, that was all the money in the world. And so what did they do? They started hiring. They started acquiring material. They started doing crazy stuff like doing what were called auction scripts, where, and the most infamous of these was a movie called Ticking Man that had Bruce Willis attached to it. And what happened was it was delivered on everyone's desk in Hollywood. Okay, this was before PDFs. And there was a little alarm clock on it. And when that alarm went off, you had to have your offer in for what you were willing to pay for this. Can we say that meant no one read it? That meant all people did was write the paperwork and send it in blind. You don't ever do that. But this was happening all the time. Plus, these were package deals. Plus, they had pay or play dates, which meant that you paid people whether they worked or not. And what was happening is these companies had so much venture capital, they hired so many people and put so many things into pre-production. And a lot of these things that went into pre-production ultimately were pulled out and kill fees were paid. So even though this number sounds low right now, let's say that during the course of the year, you put 8 things into pre-production, but you ended up only making 3 movies. That meant you paid kill fees on 5 of them. Let's say that the kill fees on each of those 5 movies was somewhere around $5 to $10 million. Let's say that you had just made Dirty Dancing, which made slightly over $100 million and all that. But what was your actual profit on that? Your profit on Dirty Dancing and a profit, not revenues, but profit. Your profit on Dirty Dancing and your profit on Platoon was probably along the lines of $50 million. And here you are squandering $5 to $10 million per project on 5 or 6 projects. Can we say you're blowing through your profit? And now all of a sudden you're back at square one. What if you have nothing but failures? And I'm going to say A24 is looking at that. The trailer for Zola does not look good. It looks bad. It looks scattershot. It looks like it doesn't know what it is. And I'm going to assume that they've been testing it, and the testing for it has not been great. So therefore, they're looking at what could be a loss. And so these 2 articles are there to say, we're up for bid. Everyone says they need content. We've got content. Buy us now. What's the other shoe on this? The other shoe on this, even though it's not stated loud, it's all sotto voce, is saying, we have a failure with this. We didn't have our distribution locked in place. Our big chunk of change that was supposed to come in from Apple or Amazon or someplace else as an output deal, meaning that they would take everything we make, didn't happen. So that means that we either have to find a whole new slew of cash, but the big slew of cash, which was coming in from China, ain't going to come to us. Why? Because most of A24's movies are artistic, which means that they tend to be culturally specific, which means they tend to be American culturally specific. China's not needing to prove that it's a big player anymore. China's now on the stage where it's going to everyone and say, show me profits. Show me profits or pay me no attention. Pay me or pay me no attention, right? So who can A24 turn to? Who's the big daddy warbucks who can save them? So that's why I feel that the combination of these two articles, the fact that they're both exclusives, is leading me to suspect there's trouble in paradise. And I could be 100% wrong. I hope I am. I love independent companies that are successful. But unfortunately, I know what it looks like when a company has a good return on investment and suddenly decides it wants to play with the big boys. It's always ugly in the end. And I think that that's what might be happening now. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe to this channel, and also please check in the description box below where I have links to my BitChute and Rumble channels. I do a number of individual commentaries that do not show up on YouTube because they talk about things that are a little bit more scandalous and tied to Hollywood's past, or other things that are, shall we say, a little bit more colorful. Anyway, this is Dan. Isn't the entertainment industry fascinating? Here we are on the verge of potentially a strike, which we'll talk about later, because I'm going to hope it gets averted. And yet we have this independent company starting to play a desperation game. Again, I want to be wrong. I don't think I am.